only hopes that the presence of the artist does not overawe the critic of the evening. Although the critic of the evening, as you know, Gayatri Sinha, has written as many as 2 books on him and has been a very well-known art critic and curator. I need not introduce her. We have this series now running, and this is the 17th in the series. And we are also very happy that we are having a Raza Foundation camp at the moment, and some of the Raza awardees are here from Mumbai, Chennai, Delhi, Pune, Jaipur, Bhopal, etc. So they are also here for this evening. So you have a multidisciplinary audience, if you like. And we have had, as you know, we started with the first talk was by Kumar Shahani on a painting by Vivan Sundaram, who also is here.
But I wasn't there then.
You wasn't there then. You were away.
That's why he gave a good talk.
So I hope you don't take his suggestion seriously and make yourself disappear while ensuring a good talk. Anyway, so on behalf of Copal Art, we welcome you this evening. And now, Gayatri Sinha.
Introduction, but thank you very much. And am I awed by Krishen Khanna? I was deeply awed by Krishen Khanna. We wrote our first book we started I think in about 1994, and the project culminated in 1997. I was a much younger writer at that point. Somewhere in the middle I had a baby, and the project had to be delicately managed with a child. And the way we did it was Krishen Khanna and Renu auntie would come once a week to my home. It was their act of generosity actually which allowed us to complete the manuscript. And he would take very frequent breaks and go to Simla, and the exchange of ideas continued through letters. I thought I'd return to that frame, and that's in fact the way that I'm making this presentation. It's in the same tone of conversation that actually sustained this project over a period of 3 years. Dear Uncle Krishen, normally at this time of the year you would be up in Simla. You would have driven up in your dinky yellow Zen, past the roads laid by the Tibetans in the 1960s, roads that led to your glass studio and gently overgrown garden in Ravensdale. The gentleman's life of a summer retreat in the hills, of painting and walks on the mall in the evening with Auntie Renu. A world so insular that it bears no comparison or repetition in Indian art. The other day, another saffron art auction image appeared in my mailbox, a Last Supper, one of many that you had painted, tantalizingly labeled Suspense at Last Supper, the image on your left. It bore many of the marks of the world that you evoke and retreat to in your paintings, but also slight shifts in register. A group of men, raw-boned and distinctly working class, in the throes of numerous points of conversation. Unnoticed by them is the dhaba servitor, a mundu, as bread bearer, who will proceed to slap bread down onto so many steel or aluminium plates, his thin arm flailing down between the talking men, but who for the moment stands stock still. If there is an axis of stillness in the painting, it is between the man in the center, haloed by his yellow shawl, and the bread bearer on the right. The Bible is full of metaphors around bread. The leavening and the rising of bread, the breaking of bread, the loaves and the fishes, the holy sacrament. In this axis of silence, there is a shared moment of epiphany, if you like, between only those who know, the man in the center and the young, ungainly bread bearer. But let us leave them for the moment. Sometime in 1997, we began the project of a book. Already you in your mid-70s, for you in your mid-70s, the book was late in coming. We built a bi-weekly structure of meetings, and a sort of back and forth narrative unfolded. Your friendships, and now the years of occasional distance with your fellow artists. Roger Fry and Clive Bell, Cakes and Tea. In the context of the late 90s, these narratives were already a few decades old. As a critic in a newspaper working on the contemporary, these pushed my line of inquiry of art into a two-tiered time frame. But your paintings were to take me back even further. If we are to take stock, it is in the movement between the ordinary and the climactic that has determined the stories you choose and what you paint. How and why did you arrive at this place? You frequently speak of art as a proposition. In turn, I want to suggest that the Last Supper, coming as it does in a cycle again and again in the beginning or at the end of a line of paintings, belongs to three major propositions. The first proposition is a well-established reading, one that you yourself suggest, of these paintings as political critique. The decade of the 1970s with the Bangladesh War, the emergency imposed by Indira Gandhi, and the resultant political turmoil challenged and demolished the Nehruvian utopia with which you would have crossed the border in the late 1940s, and your growing years into mature manhood of the 50s. Possibly the first among these paintings, without any political context, is Betrayal, done while you were still in Madras in the 50s. The white and cream tones so reflective of the deep southern light. From the late 60s onwards, and then for the next 40 years, you have engaged in a series of paintings on the New Testament that start with the Last Supper and the Garden at Gethsemane, and gradually culminate in Betrayal, Pieta, Emmaus, and Doubting Thomas. The series gains significance not only because of its appearance so close in time to the political climax of the 70s, a period of midnight arrests, censorship of the press, and a repressive state machinery, but because of the kinship it shares with your other work of the time. And I'm able to show 4 or 5 images of the Pieta, which are fascinating because of the chromatic choice that the artist adheres to. It is a climate in which power masquerades as order, and colonial laws which are hostile to the subject are still operative. From the late 1970s, you had also developed on what you described as the tragic and perfidious in man, a subject that you return to again and again. But despite the overwhelming biblical references, you have interpreted the events in a wholly Indian context. The central figure, Jesus, and his disciples are like the ordinary rough-hewn laborers of Delhi. Regarding the setting, you said to me, all good art has to be local. When I say local, I mean an artist has to draw from the things near him, so that a certain passion comes through in his paintings. At the same time, great art transcends the ordinary moment and strikes a moment in infinity, unquote. That you return to the subject of the Christ cycle over the years really reinforces the power of the narrative, as much as your need to identify the victim. Communal riots in Gujarat, Moradabad or Bhogal, and then their resonance 30 years later in Godhra in Gujarat in 2002 and 3 resurrect a sense of betrayal. Christ's absorption into the lumpen labor of the city is complete. There is neither the healing Christ, the divine worker of miracles, or the haloed Son of God, but the persecuted figure within an oppressive system. Bhogal, as a post-partition resettlement colony of refugees, evokes in you a spirit of sympathetic kinship. It is from the late 60s to the 70s that you paint the men of the streets. In small dhabas, as in Ramuka Dhaba, the laborers crowding in to the back of the truck. Just go through these. In the back of trucks in the series Rear View, all of them representing scenes of restless movement. Your entire concern with the biblical theme of Christ's betrayal is informed by a sense of the failed promises of a state, its inability to protect the weak. In your work, the religious content then becomes overwhelmingly social. We do not see Christ, the Son of God, as reformer, healer, preacher, iconoclast, as a leader of men. Instead, he becomes the human prototype pushed to the brink of an impending cataclysm. The figures are from contemporary and modern Delhi, specifically the Nizamuddin Bhogal area where you lived with your family for over a decade, your children and your parents in a small apartment. These figures have a strongly defined quality, the rugged physique of the labor class, sun-darkened bodies and rough, even callous faces. Sketching alone in the small tea shops of Bhogal, you recreated the figures that constructed the city of the 60s and the 70s, now so resonant with the Delhi of today, as it heaved and lumbered uncomfortably into a developing third world capital of replicated government colonies, institutions, office blocks that virtually characterized New Delhi. Bhogal Nizamuddin became the laboratory of your observation. The second proposition is that painting is an extension of your passion for poetry. And what can be greater in terms of poetic depth and grandeur than the epic? And I use here the term epic in the broadest sense. There are 2 or 3 epic strains in your work: the Mahabharata, the Bible, and the partition of India. The betrayal of Bhishma Pitama in the Mahabharata is not unlike Christ at the Last Supper. But devoid of heroic acts, the subaltern that you paint becomes elevated to an epic dimension. Biblical narratives have been interpreted by your confreres among the progressive artists group and bear out interesting points of comparison. In the religiously diverse composition of the progressive artists, educated at Jesuit schools, biblical narratives would have been a shared context. Certainly in a post-colonial situation, the figure of the Christian saint would have been a contested subject. In the paintings of Sousa, the narratives of the New Testament serve like a form of aggressive self-definition. Sousa's saints are iconically rendered like Byzantine figures, defined by the dark outlines of a rua, rendering them disturbing, even menacing. His early communist leanings would also have predisposed him towards saints as figures of a perverse and wayward authority. Sousa's painted Christs shift in register from the sexual to the violently persecuted, often supported by powerful Pieta figures. These he represents as a distinct development in figurative painting. And I quote from Sousa, "In the Last Supper there are 2 or 3 faces, and they are drawn in a completely new iconography beyond Picasso." Thus, the artist claims, quote, "to have drawn the physiognomy way beyond Picasso in completely new terms through the Last Supper," unquote. Of course, the other modernist who engaged in a series of paintings on the saints, Akbar Padamsi, presented them with a fixed iconicity and a deep, somber dignity. Certainly in Sousa and in your work, Christ becomes emblematic of resistance to persecution. But let us return to our subject, the Last Supper. Typically, the subject introduces the apostles and Jesus around a table. Its square dimensions over a compressed view that is emphasized by the raised perspective that you often assume, affording a foreshortened view of the scene. The related paintings that come before and after this series are scenes from dhabas, ubiquitous, democratic, classless eating places. Already the figure that we have seen before, of a yellow shawl, of Christ in a yellow shawl, has made an appearance as a stranger in Gyaniji's dhaba, one of the many rough men separate only in his luminosity. If we use Da Vinci's Last Supper as a bare reference, which you saw and first attempted at the age of 7, we see a profoundly indigenous and subaltern view at work. Many of the well-known identifying elements of the Last Supper, such as the remains of the repast, the bread, and the Eucharist, are dispensed with. As Christ speaks of imminent betrayal, each of the disciples, except Judas, react with a profound emotion, from Philip and John's intense questioning to the expressly held hand of Thaddeus. All architectural detail or a view of the well-illuminated landscape behind the apostles are dispensed with. The Last Supper is set in an interior with such compression that we have the feeling of a single Spartan room where even the air is still. The beams overhead appear to weigh down heavily. In an earlier version, no source of light is visible. Christ himself is a solitary source of illumination, and the shadows appear to descend into the edges of the frame. In dispensing with all props and accoutrements, he nevertheless retains the possibility of symbolic interpretation. The central Christ, who cups his hand on the table in a void, illuminated in the face and upper body, bound tightly with a cloth. The disciples around the table enact the responses that his revelation inevitably brings, from dismay to animated exchange. The uncertain location, the absence of any social content is only mitigated by the disciples themselves. Their rough clothing, largely unstitched in the manner of Indian farmers or poor laborers, their heavy features and limbs identify them as working class men. By locating the Last Supper within this group, you open up the possibilities of numerous interpretations. The absence of the vestige of a meal, the subaltern status of the men, and their tense, huddled bodies reveal an anxious concern with issues of survival. Your paintings of the subaltern are also an engaging psychological document of the changing character of the city of Delhi. These works are not concerned with the subject of interiority, or indeed the location of the subject. Black truck, fleeting details only, insofar as they affect your human subjects. From your location on Mathura Road, which is one of the main arterial entries into the city from the neighboring states of Haryana and Uttar Pradesh, you have made a panoply of unidentified men who work and heave and shift the materials of a city in the throes of seeking form, identity, habitation, purpose. Now, I think here of what Gautam Bhadra describes as the mentality of subalternity. Bhadra speaks of subordination and domination as political realities, and the manner in which subordinate groups become dominant at a critical historical moment. He writes, quote, "The religious message that teaches submission also forms the basis of rebellion." And I think this is particularly pertinent to your painting. In your painting, the oscillation between the laboring figure and then the reappearance of the figure of divinity contains elements of both submission and heroic transgression. Further, the fact that you locate the passive rebellion of Christ not within the mainstream faiths of post-colonial India, but in the Christ narrative speaks of a politically defined climate of minority persecution in which resistance becomes not only individual but cultural. In his analysis of the marginal, Homi Bhabha speaks of the figures on the margins as those that belong within a state but bear only a tenuous claim to its benefits. Arguably, in your paintings, the modernity project of India, envisioned through Delhi in the 70s, 80s, 90s, up to now, is largely repudiated. The benefits of classic liberalism that drive modernization do not appear to filter down to the actual builders of the citadels of modernity. The final proposition, of course, is that the Last Supper is not really about the Christ. It is about yourself and the world that you inhabit, its fraternity, its conflicts, and of the artist entombed in his studio. After all, your introduction to Christian theology was intensely human and fraught with the realization of human vulnerability. When your father returned from his doctoral studies in England in 1932, he brought with him a copy of Da Vinci's Last Supper. This you keenly studied and produced your first copy at the age of 7. A few years later, as a schoolboy in war-stricken England, when you couldn't come home for the holidays, you spent your vacations at the vicarage of the Franciscan brother Joseph Gardner. Joseph Gardner reinforced your readings of the Bible. The gentle figure who looked after children with handicaps inspired your first painting of Saint Francis and the birds, a recurring subject in your painting, rendered in a peaceable, natural world. But as an adult painter, familiar with the Western canon, there would be other painterly references to Christian theology. If we consider, for instance, Salvador Dali and the sacrament of the Last Supper, Dali spoke of his painting as, quote, arithmetic and philosophical cosmogony based on paranoid sublimity of the number 12. The pentagon contains microcosmic man, Christ, unquote. Your work subverts the notion of the spiritual significance of the number 12 to comment on your own artistic fraternity, the proponents of the modern art movement project in India. In a suite of related paintings, it is critical painters of the 20th century who come to be presented as 12 unlikely apostles. Let me go back to this. In The Last Supper of 2004, Jagdish Swaminathan, clad in a lungi, artist and ideologue, your competing interlocutor and friend from the days of Gadi, vies for attention in the foreground. For several years, Swami and you were neighbors in the Gadi art studios. There you exchanged friendly and frequently oppositional views on modernity, in the company of others, notably Himmat and Manjeet Baba. You who wrote of Swami's paintings admiringly as, quote, a universe of mystery and wonder, creating images which are about to reveal themselves but never quite do so, present him here enigmatically in this work as the disciple who holds up his finger in the interrogating gesture. Is it me? The picture gains poignancy when seen in relationship to canonization of a painter. An obvious reference to the critical acclaim showered on Bhupen Khakkar. Khakkar, who moves out of the modern art project, you might say. The painting also has another companion piece, The Last Bite of 2005, which is edgy and fraught with human living theatre. An interplay of characters identified by their ambitions, affiliations, and idiosyncrasies. Instead of the central figure of the Christ, it is Hussein, who sits at the center of the table. He is holding a cup that recalls Christ's cup of bitterness. That is how I would like to interpret it. Perhaps it is a cup that is filled, but when it overflows with bitterness. One that will overflow and have no redemption. The configuration of artists that you introduce is apocryphal, a slice of modern Indian art history. Hussain is flanked on the left by your buddy Bal Chabra, Tayyab Mehta, Souza, and Bhanu Athaiya, the only woman who was a member of the progressive group, who shot into prominence not as a painter, but as a costume designer for Bombay films, with her award-winning contribution for Attenborough's Gandhi. From the loose fraternity of the progressives, there is also the bespectacled Akbar Padamsi, who appears to address Bhupen, but Bhupen is preoccupied with matters far beyond the frame. On Khakkar's right, the somewhat spectral figure of Gaitonde, in conversation with Jairam Patel, who appears non-committal. As conversation appears to fly around the table, Jogin Chaudhary looks contemplatively away and out. Manjeet Baba, Raza, and Swaminathan, in a close huddle, complete the table of artists. You have often spoken of the shared confabulation across such settings that have sustained artists, of chai sessions at Chetna restaurant in Bombay, of just a cluster of chairs at the Bombay Art Society, of meetings and the exchange of thought, which was in fact to determine your careers, of meals around the dastarkhan, of shared biryani in Hussein's house. The prominent table in these paintings is, as you state, a formal device that defines the painting. This is I'm quoting from you, but it is also a divider. Beyond a compositional division, which you use abundantly in your work, most prominently, let us say, in the anatomy lesson, again something that you have returned to on more than one occasion. Here the division apparent at the table is the differing views of Indian modernism, and the debate that raged between the poles of indigenism and internationalism, between the progressives and Group 1890 led by Swami and friends. Through the 1960s and 70s, the chief preoccupation in Indian art was the central ideological concern, with artists arraigned on either side of the debate. I'm intrigued by the question, how do you decide whom to put in and whom to take out? Perhaps the striking exclusions are Ghulam Muhammad Sheikh, who emerged as a forceful ideologue out of the Swaminathan-led group of 1890. Admittedly, he comes a generation later. And even more importantly, Ram Kumar, who has probably been the most faithful adherent of the Paris school of abstraction that several of the progressives initially followed, as did you yourself. Your composition locates such leading figures around the table in apparent confabulation. Yet, on closer inspection, there appear to be several dialogues on at the same time, areas of patent distraction, perhaps a lack of coherence, like the numerous distributories that led away from the monolith of modernism. This is a painting that marks your affection for your fraternity of artists, in the true modernist spirit that honors the artist at the apex of art production. But it also speaks of the artist as prophet and wayshore. And the confabulation of your group with the 12 disciples is in that way deeply indicative of this position. If we look at it in the light of the Hussein narrative, of betrayal by a social system that refuses to protect him, rendering him a figure of public persecution, or the one who was turned away, then we see the painting as truly apocryphal. But now we must return to our own Last Supper, the chosen Last Supper, if you like, to the stillness of the exchange between Christ and the bread bearer, unconscious witness. It is a moment that comes unannounced, full of possibility, a view of the future, a kernel of youth, of truth and perfidy. Perhaps you will return to the subject again, as you are wont to do, to find another human dimension, another proposition. Thank you.
And then the others will start shooting. But then the first one has to be a brave one. So go ahead.
I'm brave. 6 feet high, 7 feet high. Just about this size. Just a minute, please get the mic. I'd like to add something
Yes, please.
about the last bite. The Tayyab asked me when he saw this painting, and he looked at it very carefully. He says, "But where are you?" To which my answer was, "I've eaten and gone away."
About modern Indian art, that is all framed with these people, the progressives in that generation. But we do know now that contemporary Indian art, as it shifted its kind of position from the progressive modernists, which by and large did not use the word narrative. And then we know that the metaphysical school, the Tantric school came about, and that then the movement towards narrative painting started. And in some way, I think the kind of openness and alertness of Krishen, in a way to veer away from the kind of very strict, positions that whether it's Raza or Akbar. I mean, Hussain is a very different case, so we won't bring him into the picture. But Krishen, I think, was very open to the sort of dialogues and talk that was going on of the next generation, which named themselves Place for People, narrative painters. What is your perception of this? I mean, that as an art historian, would it not be important to, because it's covering the same period, and What are any possible links, and then of course the
I think
differences?
what I left out of this, because it's not something I've completely framed in my own thinking, but this is something I've written about and it's been published, was the two painters that I think he bears considerable affinity to are Bhupen and Sudhir Patwardhan. And Sudhir, I think, with the urbanism and the modernity project, is very close to where Krishen is. The cities, I mean, and I don't mean it only in the obvious sense of the city. There is, even in Sudhir's narrative, there is a sense of a broader metaphysics. In Krishen, there is a specific narrative about the location. And as I was going through the pictures again and again, there are some that I left out, because the contextualization seemed to be neither here nor there for this evening. For instance, there is a series of paintings on the act of flagellation. Men being flagellated in police stations. Showed there even more of them. They're being held by their beards. Some of them have caps, etc. I think the specificity of this location within a community is where there is a certain kind of a shift. Sudhir allows architecture to dominate in a way that it closes in. The last series of works that we've seen of Sudhir here in Delhi, it's almost like a photographic panorama, and he has indeed used photographs of the city like a horizon closing in on the individual. Krishen actually, in a sense, opens it out. I think he's interesting closer to Davi, someone like Davi, and the framing of the colonial police station that Krishen uses with the arches is very interesting. We see it in some of the Last Suppers. Davi, the French Davi, yeah. You know, the foreshortened, the compressed stage-like proscenium foreground and the architecture that's brought back in. It's almost like a backdrop. And the Krishen uses 2-3 types of things which are very interesting. One is this kind of low beams, tight frame. I think it works for him. It also suggests class. And in that sense, of course, there are affinities with Bhupen and with Sudhir Patwardhan. The other thing that he does is that he uses the colonial arch very often in a lot of the police stations and the acts of violence. It's the colonial police station of Delhi. Many of these we have remnants of. Bhupen relieves it. I think Bhupen appropriates the city's space. He makes it his own, and he needs to be able to. He successfully locates the city as a site of possibility. Here, I think there is another kind of a dynamic. I think there are things being brought to the table and taken away from the table again and again. And in this lies a slightly different trajectory of narrative. In Sudhir, there is a certain closure. In Krishen, I think there is really a certain sense of openness. The way he deals with the edges of the frame, several of the works, if we were to run through them again, animals, the bullock putting its mouth in to eat the watermelon from the child, the dog sniffing at someone in an act of flagellation, the sense of opening out into the noise, the chaos. There's always the sense of that moment. That's there. And then the closure where people come, they congregate, there is an exchange, and there is there is a movement here, a movement which is ineffably tragic. There is loss. And in Sudhir and in Bhupen, this sense of loss is there, but it is so different. It is not of a metaphysical order as it is with Krishen. With Krishen, I think there is something spiritual, there is an act of spiritual inquiry about his own location that goes on again and again. But yes, when I have published, I think it's in this book called Embrace of Love, I've compared his work with Sudhir Patwardhan and Bhupen.
Word which I was waiting for in some ways, which is allegory. And Krishen works with the allegory. I mean, there's the obvious allegorical use of the biblical text and reference, but there is, because of whether the actual reference precedes the use of allegory, or that he has an allegorical turn of mind, which could come from his love of literature. So, I mean, his first love is probably poetry, and that's lyric, but he's a reader of literature widely. So, allegory would be part of the corpus of the imaginary reader would have. And so, I think that he constantly uses not just the specific allegorical mode to the Christ legend, but he uses the allegorical mode throughout. And that might be the very definite difference from, say, Sudhir Patwardhan. I am less convinced about the relationship with Bhupen, because the questions Bhupen raises are very, very, different. I can see that
in a broad
I can see the reason why you must bring in Bhupen, because he re-articulates the city in a certain way. But Sudhir's trajectory would be much more in relationship to realism. He follows that lineage and works with it in the contemporary. So he has to do a lot of reworking of the realist canon, but he nevertheless does that. Krishen really is from the modernist tradition. He is like from high modernism, which was in some ways completely was in opposition to realism. So he comes from the modernist lineage, and then arrives at an allegory which we must remember the first decades of the 20th century. The modernists were invoking allegory. Rouault, for example, was. In fact, allegory was quite centrally used in expressionism and in surrealism, but certainly the tradition that Krishen comes from would use allegory in the first half of the 20th century, not later. But he comes nevertheless from that modernist tradition. So that could be one of the defining dichotomies between the dichotomy or differences between the next generation of figurative narrative painters and Krishen, who comes into that broad frame but retains his modernist.
Thank you. No, that's very valuable. I think there are 2-3 things going on with Krishen. Need to articulate class. I think this is where he then looks forward into the next generation with much greater conviction than many of his confreres. I think that's very important. But if there are any questions? Yes.
So many different pictures today with Christian topics, which I have not seen yet. And I think you must have seen all of them because you have done all the books on him. Do you have an idea how many percentage or how many pieces of his paintings are dealing with these Christian allusions or Christian topics? That is one question. And the second question I have is dealing with this person who is going to serve the people. I have always looked at that person. Why is he bare-bodied? Why does he have no dress? Why is he a Dalit? Because the typical that the Dalit people are not allowed traditionally to cover their upper body, and I don't know if the Christ is sort of two-type in this picture.
Two
times in the picture. Once
as the boy,
as the Christ in the golden shawl, as sort of the divine, the super special, and one as the lowest. That's just an idea.
Yeah, that's what I suggest, that there is an axis of stillness and a shared epiphany between the man in the golden shawl and the child that is going to serve, but is at the moment
as the
stopped.
lowest, sort of.
Yes, that's true. But the men around the table are the same ones which will be on the trucks. They will be sleeping under the trucks next to the dogs at night. They will be the ones carrying the weights of the other
people. Dress, the question. So that is why I thought that he's sort of even lower looking than the others. It's just my observation.
Well,
maybe Uncle Krishen.
I tell you why. Because in Dhabas, I very purposely use the figure holding the bread, the pile of bread actually, which is carried, Because in dhabas you do find these mundus, they are little boys who are sort of engaged. And I wasn't being too allegorical about it at all. I mean, I was really using the figure that I've seen so many times. I mean, you go to these dhabas and you find these little boys who are very nice, very amenable, and full of zest and everything else. And that's it. He's not naked. He's wearing.
Yeah.
On the top,
I'm talking about only the top.
Well, that happens often too, particularly in hot weather. I mean, and poverty go together. He's just got a little locket around his, a little taviz, which is around his neck.
I think
it's a protective thing. But the rest, you've got a little lungi. That's all. I'm sorry.
I think the figure in Krishen Khanna's painting is the migrant.
Yes.
The migrant is the figure.
Yeah.
Whether he is young, able-bodied or old, he is a migrant.
That's right.
He's migrant labour, he's preparing for other migrations, he's constructing for migration.
In fact, if I may say so, a lot of my pictures actually deal with this whole...
There is homelessness.
Homelessness and shifting of...
There's a shifting case.
Shifting business, So there's no place like home or wherever you are.
Yes.
So.
And he himself was a migrant. Yeah. There was waves of migration in his own life, and I think it would be very interesting to see Krishen Khanna in the kind of sociological reading of the Punjabi migrant, which was done by someone like Dhanraj Bhagat from Punjab or Manas Ray from Bengal. Manas Ray's theory postulates the Punjabi migration against the Bengali migration, which is very interesting. The Punjabi migration happens in one fell sweep with all its great violence, and then the burial of a neurosis, of a mass neurosis. The Bengali migration, which we see, continues till today and manifests into the problems of Assam and the West Bengal politics, and of course of even the politics of Maharashtra. The movement of is he Bengali, is he Bangladeshi is a question which continues, but it has its genesis in the partition of Bengal. And there is, I think, a coming to terms with the issue of migration very severely in the work of Krishen Khanna, of accommodation. I think the hard fought for position of accommodation in his own sphere of activity, his own, even the fight for a language. What was his language when you move into various social and different cultural contexts, as he did? The entry into Bhogal was one of fraternity, and the fraternity that is evoked by the truck drivers, the men who service trucks, or the itinerant labor that stops by for a meal, who are also possibly apostles. I think this interchange is is very useful. I would be able to work with this.
Well, this is true. I mean, I've been
on the side of the Punjab and meeting them not because you recognize them as different, but they were doing little things. There was a little cycle mender, an old man who used to sit and repair bikes and so on. And I took our cycle for repairs, and he was at the edge of a road. And he spoke extremely well. He spoke in the dialect of Jhang, from Jhang. So I said, "Tusi Jhang to aande?" So he says, "Sai kive pata laga?" So I said, "Zaban to." So we got friendly, we got talking. In fact, a bond is immediately established through language, And so he came out with his story, which is very moving. I mean, he, like all of us, we were uprooted, went to the Punjab, and there he started. They were quite well off before the partition happened. They lost all of that, and then he started doing odd jobs like bending cycle tires and tubes, on a side. Now his children. Now this is the cultural input here. The children, the boys, were not used to seeing their father in this lowly position. So they said to the old man that you mustn't do this, stay at home. We are the breadwinners now, and we'll do it all. Well, he understood all that, but now to avoid then the sight of the father sitting down to a menial job as it was, he moved to Delhi. away from the mending cycles here, so as to prevent his children from the burden of seeing him repair cycles, you know. So this kind of thing, and this can be multiplied a million times over. I mean, this kind of thing happened again and again. It happened in our family as well.
Yes.
So one is not without it, you know. I mean, that's it. My cabin mate, who had to be drowned at sea, you know, he was suffering, and then it was quite a traumatic journey. And the next was soon after, really, was the partition of India, which we had to quit overnight. So one is not without it, you know. One can't just suppress that memory, however well one might do or whatever. But there's something which has been lost, you know.
And I think the thing that immediately came to mind was how David introduced a very shallow depth of a certain flatness which modernity took on, you know. And in some way, the question that I asked about Krishen's relationship, I mean, the narrative and to the narrative painters, is that if you see, he has a very tight frame, that it does not include really what's outside. It has no sense of landscape. They're all tableaus, you know, within a staged place, and this flatness sort of remains. So he's keeping at one level that part of the modernity project. In relationship to the question of realism, which, you know, Sudhir brings up in different ways, I think that Krishen's realism, if we can call it, but I put that in inverted commas, is not like the realism of the early 20th century, full of angst, the realism, expressionist realism, let me put the two words together, say of a Beckman. He doesn't carry that existential angst, say, like his colleague Akbar Padamsee. So the figures have a certain aspect of drawing an outline which is about the surface and a certain kind of description, and I would say even at times, like in this painting, veering into what one could loosely call even the caricature. Caricature both positive and negative. And I think that there is a whole long and honorable tradition in English art about caricature. And if Krishen is on this side of the divide or this side of the channel, then he is on the English side, whereas Souza and Akbar are on the European side of that existential.
That is a very, very good point. And Cookstown or wherever, the entire town becomes a configuration for his biblical
To
imagery.
start from Hogarth and to stand up, there is a long honorable tradition.
Yes, absolutely.
Krishen is very familiar with.
There's also, I think, in Krishen a sense of balance. This is in the kinds of narratives he evokes. There's also, if there is the grand and the epic, or even if it is related to issues of mass class, there's also the domestic, the small, the vulnerable, the childlike, and that cycle of narratives which he evokes from time to time. And I think the two actually balance out each other. They are seen. And all the time moving between these are these restless, homeless, shiftless figures, very often faceless. You will see them in passing. They're just gone. Pretty much like what your headlights will pick up on a city street.
Actually, can you have a quick run through the slideshow and just see the paintings?
Great musicians coming to your home. You were happy. Rasika was learning Bharatanatyam, fullness and abundance and fecundity, and then betrayal. Why? Why? 1950.
Well, I mean, only one case, there have been several, you know, which have, I mean, the Gethsemane picture, for instance, which you really unfortunately couldn't see properly here.
We'll go back to that.
It is actually it is the arrest at midnight. It is betrayal. It is the regular betrayal of many people and many ideologies, actually.
Yeah, the only buddy that you brought in is Swami. Are there some more painters?
I can't immediately think of them, but
Can we have this is the only size of the frame, or can we have a slightly bigger frame, please?
We can go from to slideshow from
See what's what. There's the army, or the people who are going to arrest. And,
What was the response of your...
well, this is a very, very strange story actually. When I first showed this picture, Mrs. Gandhi came on her own, and I was alone in the room. And this is soon after the emergency. And there was her attendant with her, and she, anyway.
Uncle, you want to use the mic?
Sure.
Mic?
much as to tell her what the picture was about, and then she caught my eye. The picture is titled Gethsemane or the Arrest at Midnight. That's the subtitle which is on the picture, you see. And so she looked at Usha and said, no, silly, this is the arrest of Christ. And then she caught my eye. We didn't say a word. But I think that she understood. But the betrayal has come again and again and again. I don't know why, because one sees it in all walks of life. Actually, I was just thinking about what Vibhan said, in a sense, that there is the pictures, I am very conscious of the fact that when I'm working, they're not necessarily drawn, but very sketchily. The rest, the paint has to determine. But I'm very conscious of the fact that the picture has to belong, it's within that particular frame. It's not going to shoot out. And that, I think, is very British, very English, actually, I would say. Yeah. But although in several paintings I've shown how things are going out, even half. It's clear the way the cross goes, for instance, and the way the white lines, the light yellow lines underline, delineating the cross and so on. They're very compositional. I mean, in that sense, I've got to relieve the Indian red, which is at the back somehow. It can't all be red. And similarly, it goes up to a kind of a triangle on top, on which the figures are resting, and then goes on. So these are compositional devices, or compositional attitudes, I would say, not devices per se.
And the abundance of gesture.
No, this is the gesture. I think the gesture is also, I'm actually tied between two things here. I think gesture is very important because of in dance, for instance.
Yeah, I was thinking.
It's not just any old. It's not just any old action. It's a very determined action, which is compounded with many things. It's sort of very quintessential, and so I think the gesture has to be very relevant and to that particular thing.
Krishen uses a very interesting red in a lot of these things.
Yeah, I was thinking of the same, but then he usually then completely becomes a very vivid sanguine with the bandwalas. I was thinking of exactly the same thing.
That's a totally,
It's a completely different energy.
It's almost monochrome.
Yeah, those are almost.
Maybe we should make Krishen answer this.
When did we get a major retro of Krishen Khanna in Delhi?
You had one, but it was, I think, very poorly hung up.
Yeah.
I left in deep despair.
It wasn't a credit.
It wasn't a credit to you.
I was against having a retrospective anyway. I subscribe to de Kooning's belief that you have a retrospective and then you are sort of signing your death warrant, doesn't it?
Doing that. There are even bigger. I said, you're not quite doing that, your painting is bigger.
Not sitting in anticipation, or it's after very fast and there's nothing.
That will be the same dhaba, right? Both the paintings.
I think the table is very important in the works. It's the only thing that's holding them together.
Well, I mean, it's an architectural device. It's also a composition. It works, and then the figures around it accommodates them, or they have to be fitted around it, etc. Now, in that table, for instance, there was a very conscious desire not to show the table as a table.
Mm-hmm.
And there are, for instance, there are figures there that are almost, they're tonally different to this table, but then they extend, and so they make a different kind of a mess, if you like, but it's not a delineated table in that sense. I wanted to break the edges of the table.
But in your whichever painting we've seen here of the Last Supper, the table is always red.
Yeah, I like the color red. I mean, this is actually not red. It's like a terracotta.
Yeah.
It's an orange.
This is a particularly tight frame.
There's a good reason for it.
That's what.
The reason is that it's a color which then can extend to other related colors. So in other words, actually you're making a nuance of the same thing extending.
But then it's moving out.
It's moving, yeah. That is the very first one.
Yes. The other very interesting thing is the way his style of painting has kept changing right through the Last Suppers. Yeah, and to see that as more recent to me is very interesting because it's been very stylized.
We're talking on a different kind of level of speech now, actually. Because having done so many Last Suppers, you just think that I only do the Last Supper. So they keep asking me, when are you going to do a Last Supper? I said, I've had enough.
But Vivan, your question about the narrative, I think he uses the device of the narrative within the narrative, he being the narrator of another narrative. And that happens at the familial level with his family servant, Mahantram, and there's the child sitting on the shoulder, or the biblical epic, or the Indian epics, and the possibility of being outside and within the frame. In a way, I think breaks the allegorical mode. It expands it into a more contemporary frame. I think that's what he is able to do with this story within a story. Oops.
Strangely, in this picture, the boy we were talking about who's holding the bread in his hands, that pile of bread. I did a drawing of this first, and I did a drawing of that the whole thing first, and that the boy didn't figure in the drawing. There was a fellow running down the steps carrying something and so on. Now, but I only used the drawing as a sort of a model
to work on, you see. So when I actually started painting this thing, there was no room for the man running down the steps or even the steps or anything. So I had to rethink. And what do? I still wanted somebody bringing in the food. The element of food has to be there. So I brought in this fellow right towards the end of the lifetime.
Should sit down and plot the axis of the gaze, this in this painting. It's quite interesting. None of them will meet. Yes.
Avi?
Thank you very much, Gayatri ji, and all of you. Ram Kumar ji has come. We are also grateful. Krishen, of course, and Hey Ramchandran, many other friends. And although there was no food, somehow Krishen doesn't give you food, but there is a lot of spirit outside. So you're invited to have it. Thank you.